These are some frequently asked questions regarding the California Constitution, Article 19. How many sections does Article 19 have? It contains 10 sections. What does Article 19 relate to? It relates to motor vehicle revenues. Is there a prohibition on the use of motor vehicle revenues in the state? Section 1 prohibits the legislature from borrowing revenue from the highway users tax account or its successor, and the legislature cannot use these revenues for purposes other than those specifically permitted by this Article 19. How are motor vehicle revenues distributed? Section 2 specifies that revenues from taxes imposed by the state on motor vehicle fuels for use in motor vehicles upon public streets and highways, over and above the cost of collection and any refunds authorized, must be deposited into the highway user's tax account, which is deemed to be a trust fund, and it will be allocated monthly in accordance with Section 4 of this article, and the revenues must be used only for specified purposes. How are vehicle fees and taxes distributed? Section 3 provides that revenues from fees and taxes imposed by the state upon vehicles must be used for specified purposes. Do prior allocation formulas still apply? Section 4 specifies that the statutory formulas in effect on June 30th, 2009, which allocate revenues described in Section 2 to cities, counties, and areas of the state, remain in effect. What is the legislature prohibited from doing? Section 4 prohibits the legislature from taking any action which permanently or temporarily does any of the following. 1. Changes the status of the highway user's tax account as a trust fund. 2. Borrows, diverts, or appropriates these revenues for purposes other than those described, or delays, defers, suspends, or otherwise interrupts the payment, allocation, distribution, dispersal, or transfer of revenues from the taxes that are set forth in Section 2. Can revenues be used to repay bonds? Section 5 authorizes the legislature to use the revenues approved for allocation or expenditure under this section to be pledged or used for the payment of principal and interest on voter-approved bonds that are issued for certain specified purposes. How much of the revenues can be pledged toward state bonds? Section 6 provides that up to 25% of the revenues allocated to the state pursuant to Section 4 may be pledged or used by the state upon approval by the voters and appropriation by the legislature to pay the principal and interest on voter-approved bonds. How much of the revenues can be pledged towards local bonds? Section 6 also specifies that up to 25% of the revenues allocated to any city or county pursuant to Section 4 of this article may be pledged or used only by a city or county for the payment of principal and interest on voter-approved bonds issued by that city or county for specified purposes. What happens if the legislature changes the taxes? Section 7 states that if the legislature reduces or repeals the taxes described in Section 2 and adopts an alternative source of revenue to replace the monies derived from those taxes, then the replacement revenue is required to be deposited into the highway user's tax account and dedicated to the purposes listed in Section 2 and allocated to the local jurisdictions pursuant to Section 4. Are there any exclusions from this article? Section 8 provides that this article does not affect or apply to fees or taxes imposed pursuant to the sales and use tax law or the vehicle license fee law. What happens when real property is no longer needed? Section 9 provides that any real property acquired by the expenditure of the designated tax revenues by an entity other than the state for purposes authorized may be used for local public park and recreational purposes. And finally, what happens with surplus state property? Section 10 specifies that the legislature by statute, with respect to surplus state property acquired by the expenditure of tax revenues and located in the coastal zone, may authorize the transfer of the property to specified state departments for certain specified uses.